Right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. So thank you guys so much for being here. I know it's hard on a Saturday to sort of make your way indoors when it's such a lovely day outside. But welcome to our second lecture of the series. My name is Natasha Wingreen. I am the Outreach Director at New Haven Reads. Just a little bit about New Haven Reads. Our mission is to increase the literacy skills of children by providing individually tailored one-on-one after-school tutoring, educational family support, and a community book bank, all at no cost to participants. In addition to our free book bank and our one-on-one tutoring program, New Haven Reads offers early readiness classes for pre-K and kindergarten students, as well as resources for teachers. Together with community members like you, we are building a community of readers. While our programming has had to adapt this past year, we continue to support our students and families through hybrid of online and in-person tutoring. Through this lecture series, we are excited to hear from those likewise invested in promoting literacy and expanding educational access, and to share this experience and knowledge with the wider New Haven Reads community. Thank you for joining us for today's event. So a few housekeeping items. To help ensure a quality experience for all, please keep yourself on mute. We are recording this event and we'll be sharing a link with those who registered, as well as putting it on our website and in a blog. To see the speaker only, please adjust to the speaker view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And then following the lecture, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. Please do so by typing a private message in the chat function, and then I will facilitate the questions to our guest speaker. So we are super thrilled to introduce Julie Washington. Dr. Julie Washington is a professor in the School of Education at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Washington directs the UCI Learning Disability Research Innovation Hub and is a director of the Dialect, Poverty, and Academic Success Lab at UCI. Currently, Dr. Washington's research is focused on the intersection of literacy, language variation, and poverty. In particular, her work focuses on understanding the role of cultural dialect in assessment, identification of reading disabilities in school-aged African-American children, and on the disentangling of the relationship between language production and comprehension on development of the reading and early language skills for children growing up in poverty. Please welcome Julie Washington.
Let me unmute myself. I don't think Natasha was talking to me when she said keep it on mute.
I was not.
It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, and I am happy to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart. And so I'm going to share my presentation with you. And it seems like there would never be a hiccup anymore because we've been doing this for so long now. I need slideshow here. Okay, there we are. So I'm going to talk about content of reading materials and particularly promoting interest in reading using culturally relevant reading materials. So, you know, we talk a lot about the gap in reading achievement in this country, and the gap or achievement gap, the reading gap, however you want to talk about it. We talk about between African American, Hispanic, and Native American children and their white and Asian peers. It's longstanding. It's considered intractable at this point, but we are working hard to make a difference for kids. And this poor reading ability is an educational equity issue for kids who struggle with reading for whatever reason they struggle, whether it is resources, whether it is dyslexia. It becomes about educational equity for children. It's not advancing. All right, wrong way. And so we've talked about a lot of factors related to this. Language, always important. We talk about teachers and teaching. We talk about poverty and children's motivation. But especially where it relates to motivation, there's not a lot of attention been paid to about the impact of the content of books that kids read. There are some people who are talking about this, but I don't think enough of us really are thinking about the books that we use and what difference they make. And so I'm going to start with some of the terminology that we use because there's a lot of overlap. And some of them mean slightly different things, but they're mostly referencing the same thing. So culturally relevant is used a lot in education. And one of the terms that's used a lot is culturally relevant pedagogy. It was a term that was developed, first discussed by Gloria Ladson Billings at the University of Wisconsin. And it refers in particular to teaching approaches, so pedagogy, the way that we teach kids in a student-centered way that takes into account their strengths culturally. And we use those strengths, those cultural strengths, to support them in the classroom. And so one of the examples that I like to use is oral storytelling traditions. So even where children may not have a lot of interaction with books before they get to school, many children come from cultures where storytelling, oral storytelling, is very important. And we certainly can use that kind of cultural tradition to help support what we're doing in the classroom. That's what culturally relevant pedagogy refers to. Then there's culturally responsive teaching. And this is Ladson Billings again, where we use cultural references in aspects of our learning. So our perspectives on families, where children come from, what they are experiencing in their lives. So we're being responsive to who they are as people. And then the texts that we use, our culturally relevant texts, include these issues, their identities, the norms that children relate to when they read them. So we have the way we teach, we have what's included in our teaching, and we have the text that we use to teach students who come from different backgrounds. And children should be able to see themselves, their families, and their communities in the books that we choose. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that because, you know, it's also the case that books take you away and you should be learning things that aren't close to you in books. And so, but using these culturally relevant texts to anchor students' knowledge improves their literacy outcomes. There's a bit of literature on this that talks about how students just see it as more identifiable and it affirms them and supports who they are. So Bishop in 1990, a lot of people have heard this issue of windows and mirrors. And she referred to culturally relevant texts as having mirrors and windows. So the mirror, of course, is the child being able to look at a book and see themselves in it. And the windows, they should be able to transport themselves into different worlds. And so that's that idea that at the same time, you know, I think I was talking to some teachers the other day, and sometimes we make the mistake of thinking because something should mirror a child's experience, that we should never present anything that kids can't absolutely relate to. I don't think that's what we mean. You should be able to do both. It should be both a mirror and a window. So you should be able to see yourself, but you should also be able to open the window and learn about other things. So the fact that you've never been to the beach or you've never been to Egypt doesn't mean you shouldn't learn about it. That's how we learn an awful lot about the world. Our background knowledge helps us, and that's sort of the mirror piece. But our background knowledge when we get into school should be built upon so that we open new windows and new experiences for kids. I also like the idea of sliding glass doors, which is something that Bishop talked about. So it's mirrors, windows, sliding glass doors, windows into other worlds, mirrors into the child's life. But the sliding glass door gives the child access. So that's where we come in as teachers. We choose the relevant materials, we think about who's sitting in front of us, and then we make that text transparent and inviting. And that's the sliding glass door that allows the child to walk through to literacy. And so I love this metaphor because it really is what we're trying to do. We're trying to open up the world while affirming also who the child is and then giving them access to text so that those windows are open and accessible. So when books and pedagogy mirror kids' lives, they're motivated more to read. There's a lot of literature showing that, and that's why this is important. And when they don't, when kids absolutely can't relate to books, they're more likely to disengage and read less. And that doesn't mean that every book that a child reads needs to relate to their experiences. But if you are teaching throughout the year, you introduce 30 books and 30 books don't relate, all 30 books relate to something that is not relatable to the child personally, then kids are going to be less likely to read because they don't see it as relevant to them. Why is this important to me? This doesn't reflect who I am. And so some of those 30 books need to be about your kids, but some of them need to be the window that allows them to move beyond their own personal experience. So they need to see themselves in order to increase the relevancy of reading. Um, and, you know, I often use for myself, I love to read and always have. I don't know how many people know the movie Matilda, but whenever I watch it, I'm like, I was Matilda. I would read anything. I spent a lot of time at the library. And then when I turned, I think I was 14, I discovered that there were Black authors. It took that long. It was Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. And all of a sudden I said, oh my God, a Black woman wrote this book. And I really got into her book. I read her other books and I started looking for other authors. So it wasn't that I wasn't engaged in reading before, but reading became like so um, important to me and interesting to me and in another dimension because I discovered that there were people who looked like me who were doing this writing and were writing about their own lives. And when I read about their lives, because I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings is Maya Angelou's autobiography. And so when I read it and I could relate to some of the things she was talking about, I could see my family in there. It just made me want more to read. So that's why it's important. But we talk about this all the time about how important it is, but then you can't find the books. So there's an availability of books issue. So there's a gap that exists in the availability of books for diverse cultures. And I was talking to somebody the other day from New York City, and they're creating their own books. And I know other people who have done that because these books are just not always available. I think they're more available than they used to be, but still not very available. So every year, the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison produces these statistics where they track the number of books written by and about major ethnic and racial groups in the US. And so this infographic is from 2018 and was published in 2019. You know, 2020 was the year that passed us all by. So I'm thinking this is probably the most recent one. But if you look at the diversity in children's books in 2018 and just think about the depiction of diverse groups is the way that we're talking about it here. 1% of books included American Indians that year, 5% Latinx, 7% Asian Pacific Islanders, African American 10%. And if you look at all of those combined, American Indian, Latinx, Asian American, African American, there were more books where animals actually were the characters than there were about all of those groups combined. And about half of them included white characters. And so that's what the diversity looks like in terms of race and ethnicity in 2018. And this is a year when it was getting better. So if you look back at the University of Wisconsin's statistics before 2018, we see it climbing, but it's still pretty sparse. And so children are not seeing themselves in this way in books, seeing kids who look like them. But I also want to make sure that we understand that your child's identity and thinking about their experiences is not just about race and ethnicity. Our children are so diverse in so many different ways. And so when we're thinking about looking for books, we might have a classroom that has primarily African American kids or primarily Latino kids. And so we're looking for those kinds of books. But what other identities do children have in your classroom? What are their experiences? Here's an example of a book about children who are refugees. And I know I just moved to California from Georgia, and right outside of Atlanta, in Clarkston, Georgia, there is a really large refugee community. And so thinking about those kids, I might think about their race and ethnicity, but their backgrounds are so unique, how they got to this country. And books that honor that and recognize that and reflect that would also be important for those students. Then there are students who are growing up, families who are experiencing homelessness. No Fixed Address focuses on children who are growing up in environments that are not very stable and not fixed. And well, that's part of those children's identity. And Tight Times, you know, a lot of children are experiencing hunger. They're experiencing all kinds of things that aren't represented in many of the books that we choose. And so those are all part of their experiences and their identities. I often think when I look at some of the things that we use, especially in curricula, where when you look at families, it's always two parents and 2.5 kids, the white picket fence. How does the child whose experience is not like that, whose family does not look like that, what do they think about who they are? Are they not valid? Are they not important to consider? Those children should be able to see, yeah, there are other families that look like mine, not just that my family is so different from everything else that I never get to see it in books. When I was at Georgia State, I had a doctoral student whom I loved very much, and she came from a background where the extended family was all, you know, living in the same house. And she said to me, I was in college before I knew that everybody didn't live with their cousins. And I thought that was so funny. And we laughed about it, but it made me think about how, for her, this was her reality in the community that she lived in. And so she was fine with it. But she said, I never saw it anywhere else. And there are a lot of children who live with their extended families. That's how they make ends meet in tight times. Or it may just be a cultural um, context like it was for her. Culturally, it was very comfortable for her. So when we think about books and culturally relevant books, it is not just about race and ethnicity. It is about the experiences that your children are bringing to the classroom that define who they are, that fill their days when they're outside of school. So all of that said, is it really just about the books? Not really. So I said all of that and I get all excited and passionate about it. But getting books that include Black and Brown images and images about uh, children's home life is not sufficient. It's the way we use the books to tap the cultural fund of knowledge. I love that phrase that Risco and Walker Dalhouse used in 2007. Their cultural fund of knowledge, students possess and using it to support learning. So what do your students already know when they come to school? I know some of you know that I am focused, my research focuses on African American children growing up in poverty. And one of the things I like to remind people of is that children are not blank slates. They don't come to school not knowing anything. They know a lot. They know a lot about the world, but it's a different world than the world they might encounter in school. And they know different things, different language, different customs and traditions. And how do we tap those when they get into the classroom in order to um, make a connection with them and integrate their experiences into the way that we teach? That's what we want to do when we use books. So effective use of text requires you to have knowledge of your students. Where do your students go when they leave school every day? You know, there's an assumption that everybody goes home. But I remember when I was in Michigan and I was working with students in the school district, the students I was working with, none of them went home when at the end of the day. They went to the community center and they spent the evening there until their parents got off work, or they went to grandma's house, or they went to the babysitter's house. Where do they go when they leave school every day? How do your students spend their time on the weekends? What are they doing? You know, are they just playing in the neighborhood? I worked with a group of kids once who were together all day at school, and then they were together all weekend and all evening after school. And so they fought all the time in the classroom. And the teacher's like, oh my God, what is it with these kids? And well, they function like siblings because they're together all the time. And so the way that she approached them in the classroom changed because they had a relationship that was among them that was very different than you typically see in students who are really only encountering them each other in the classroom. So culturally relevant teaching is about the individuals in your classroom as much as it's about racial and ethnicity and where they come from. And so how do we do this? One of the things is to educate yourself. Do you know the students in your classroom? If I pointed to 3 kids in your classroom, could you tell me where they came from? What do they do after school? Where are they on the weekend? Who do they live with? What kind of influences do they have in their lives? So the first thing we do is we educate ourselves about students and then also about having these conversations about students and their lives. Conversations can be framed to make students feel validated and seen. And some of these conversations are not always easy because uncomfortable topics can come up. I've had that experience when I was a young assistant professor. I was working with a group of students who were all low income. Most of them were experiencing homelessness. And I would say innocently on Monday when we came back, hey, it's good to see you today. How was your weekend? And get answers like, my daddy went to jail or things like that. And then it was like, what do I say now? And so these conversations are not always easy, but they're conversations sometimes that students need to have in order to feel like we see them and we know who they are and we still are really very happy to have you in the classroom. So some of this education is about who your students are racially, ethnically, culturally, and in their day-to-day lives. And so you use these texts to help students speak more freely, talk to you about things, be more critical. And criticality is something that Goldie Muhammad talks about a lot. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this framework. It's several school districts are using it. And Cultivating Genius is a book that talks about the literacy journey of African American people in a historical context. Goldie was a colleague of mine, and she's a friend when I was at Georgia State. And I was really fascinated and learned a lot from her about how she takes the historical context of African American people as a literate culture that came here from a place where we were very proud. We came here, it was taken away from us, and now we need to get it back. That's the way she talks about it. And the way that she talks about this, she encourages critical thinking and identity development. And identity development is not only around race and ethnicity. I don't know how many times I can say that, but as a child who reads, your identity as a reader is important also. Do you see yourself as a reader? And if you don't, what do I, as your teacher, need to do in order to help you see yourself as someone who reads and has comfort and competence with reading? So Risco and Walker Dalhouse talk about cultural modeling. It's a framework that involves designing instructions so that you're making explicit connections between instructional content, literacy goals, and who your students are. And 2 of the important components are respect for differences and use of differences as teaching resources. Sometimes we pathologize differences. In fact, we do that a lot in the United States and probably other countries, but I'm American, so I know what we do. And this is the idea that when your students come to school and they're doing something that's very different from what you do in your own life, you can either see that as a difference, respect it, and figure out how you can incorporate it, or you can pathologize it and decide that it's incorrect and you just need to change it. And so those are 2 like extremes at different poles. And we see that a lot in education, that we're each making a decision when we have students in our classrooms about whether we're going to respect who they are and these things that they do that might be a little foreign to us. but that are really important in their culture. And we can use those to teach and have students teach us about who they are. So we're identifying common practices and those that kind of transcend communities, generations, individuals, and trying to incorporate those into our teaching and our thinking about our students. And so we can start with these texts that build upon prior knowledge. That's kind of the idea of this, that children aren't blank slates. They know so much when they come to school. Sometimes it's not compatible with school. So it's not what we expect. Like we talk a lot of, in the literacy community about um, book reading at home and parent child book reading, that's just not happening everywhere. Parents aren't always reading to their kids. And I remember when I first started doing this work, I used to say that if development of literacy hinges on parent child book reading, we're all in trouble because everybody's not doing that. And so, what are they doing? That's the thing we want to know about cultural modeling. What are they doing at home? Are they playing games? Are there family activities and experiences that they have that we can use to build on so that we're developing vocabulary, creating rhymes around things that make sense to kids, and writing stories and creating writing activities around who our kids are and valuing their experience. They just know so much more than we think they do. And using these materials that hold meaning to students, this is just kind of beating the same horse with McCollin and O'Shea. They talked about how community interest can be used to explore alphabetic knowledge, letter sound association, all these things that are important for us for developing early reading. So we're linking students' reading acquisition and their motivation to things that they bring with them to school. I have a very good friend in Milwaukee who was working with Head Start, and I actually have the book that she gave me a copy of it, and it was these Head Start teachers who were seeing students come to school, and every day, the students weren't necessarily engaged with literacy, but they were talking about all these things that happened, on the weekend, and she was like, "Oh my God, the things that are happening to these kids in their lives." Then she came in one day and said, "Let's talk about the good news in our neighborhood instead of the things that are bad. There have to be good things that are happening." So every day the kids would come to school and they talk about the good news in the neighborhood. Then she gave them a camera and told them to go take pictures of the good news in the neighborhood. And guess what? They turned it into a book and got an independent publisher to publish it. And so it became this book that kids were so proud of, that it has pictures of the barber in the neighborhood, in the barber shop cutting hair. It has pictures of the local store. And it got kids really excited about reading and about talking about who they were in class. This is always one of my examples of a fantastic way to respond to students who were struggling and who didn't necessarily see the connection between the kinds of things they were talking about and what they were encountering at school. And so when we are reading, we can develop these activities and provide students the opportunity to develop these early reading skills based on their own prior knowledge and experiences. That's the mirror. And then we're going to take that and use it to extend and open a window that allows them to learn even more about some of these things. And so that's kind of the message. Teach for America, many of us are familiar with, and I had the opportunity in the past to do training with Teach for America teachers. And one of the things that, as their philosophy, that I loved was that in life, our beliefs drive our actions, and the same is true for teaching. And so, culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally relevant texts equip teachers to provide an education that recognizes and celebrates the identity, lived experiences, and culture of our students. It's an education that nurtures their inherent brilliance and infinite potential. And I'm actually working on an article right now, or a book chapter, where we talk about our expectations for students. If we believe that students are brilliant um, and have infinite potential, then we will teach them that way. I work still on a board with a school for families experiencing homelessness. And one of the promises we make to those families is that we will educate their children beyond circumstance. And that's really what we're talking about, looking at the circumstances and the experiences that students bring to school, seeing the value in those, seeing the opportunity in those experiences, and using it to get students excited about literacy. And that's our goal with these conversations about cultural relevancy. And I will stop sharing my screen and talk.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Julie Washington. I really appreciate it. So I think we're going to open it up to questions, but I just want to say off the get-go that the two things that really struck me were the concept of the mirror window and the sliding glass door, sort of thinking of it in those ways. And then also that there's other identities besides racial identities that we aren't sort of playing into factors when we reach our students or start to reach our students. So those are the two that really struck me, but it looks like we have some questions coming in. So first thing I have for you is, can you talk more about the tension between the mirror and the window? A child's identity may be equal parts culturally inherited, and on the other hand, aspirational or fantastical. Can you share any thoughts on how to bridge these two?
Yeah, I think sometimes we're a little too literal when we think about mirrors. And so I've had teachers say, well, that's not appropriate to do because, that's not culturally relevant. Well, part of school is to learn new things. And so, but without discounting what students come to school with, because they do come to school with often with experiences that are very different. And when we can build on those and understand those, it can really change the way we teach. When I was working in Ann Arbor, we were working with kids who were coming from a low income background. And the teacher was talking to me about how when she would read to them, they wouldn't talk and they weren't answering questions. And oh my God, I have so much work to do. And I said, well, how do their parents read to them? What are the expectations when they're reading? Well, the expectation was to be quiet and listen because the parents told me that. Shut up and listen.
Uh-huh.
I'm reading, you're listening. And so when you get to school and the teacher expects you to be talking while she's reading, you've been taught that it's polite and appropriate for you not to talk. And so, for that teacher, it was give them permission to talk because they've been taught that they should just listen to you when you read. And so this was a cultural experience that they were having with their parents. And it clashed with what the teacher expected at school. And the reality was, once she gave them permission, I want you to talk. Let's talk about the book. Then all of a sudden, she couldn't keep them quiet. And that that was one of those spaces where um, the kids' experiences were different from what the school expected. And so we needed to tell them that this was a different experience. And then those teachers were starting by talking about, let's talk about what you are doing, on the weekend. What are you doing? And then relating it to a book where someone might be doing those things, but then extending it beyond that. So you may know something about, goldfish. Now let's talk about the sea and what kind of fish do we see in the sea, and moving kids beyond what they know. So starting with their experience and moving them forward. If we only include content that is absolutely relatable to kids and their experiences, we don't open windows for them. We don't give them the opportunity to experience additional things. And I think it's not hard as long as we are more flexible in the way that we think about it.
Mm-hmm. And curious about if there's any strategy between, moving away from mirror to window to sliding glass door with age. So is there like a strategy for younger students? Do you want to focus more on trying to get them to start to enjoy reading on that mirror side of things and then move through? Or like, is there any sort of strategy related to age?
That's an interesting question. And I'm not sure I know the answer to that for literacy, but I know that linguistically, that what we often see with students as they get older is that with language, language is a group membership issue. And so often it is about what's closer to them and then going out from there. Because when we talk about things, for example, like using the language of school, we have to give them a reason as they get older because it's a personal identity and group membership issue. And so, what it means for the student is when you say you need to use the language of school, a lot of times you're asking them to choose you over their friends. And that's not going to happen often at 13 and 14. And so we have to find different ways to access that. So we know that's true for language, that if we're going to talk about using academic language, that we'll do it very differently with a 5-year-old than we will do with a 10 or 11-year-old whose own personal identity and social context is changing so much. And so I suspect that the same is probably true for reading, but I don't know that for sure.
Gotcha. Um, so another question, how can teachers set a tone of affirmation of each student's background and experience early in the school year when they might not know their students very well?
Um, well, I think one of the first things you do is try to get to know your students. And I think you affirm your students when you really believe it. And so I think a lot of times we have to check our beliefs about students. And if you really believe that everybody sitting in front of you is capable and is going to soar in your classroom, then you will be affirming when they walk through the door. I'm happy to see you. I'm glad you're at school. I know you're going to learn a lot. Now let me learn something about you. I really believe that that comes from a personal space for teachers about being affirming. It depends on how you think about your students. And the way you think about them, no matter what you say, will be the way you treat them. And so if you say you really believe in them, but you're really thinking, oh my God, this is never going to work, then you're actually going to teach that way. And students can tell, kids can tell everything. They like know everything about the world, but they can really tell when you really believe in them. And you do have to spend time after you get in class getting to know them. But I think the affirming them when they walk through the classroom is just believing every child can learn and treating them like they can.
Hmm. Hmm. So this is our last question. Thank you so much. And this person says, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. The story about the Good News photo book makes me think that writing in an autobiographical way could be an important tool in literacy education to fill the gaps in the available children's literature, which may not reflect a student's experience. Have you seen more of this approach in literacy education?
Yes, and I'm seeing it more and more actually, which is encouraging and sad all at the same time
Yeah.
that people really have to do that. But I love the Good News story because the book that they came up with, I now have in my library. It was amazing, meaningful to every child who was in that classroom and the kids who come next year because it's the same neighborhood. And so they're still using it. But I had a really good friend who was running an early learning sort of collaborative in DC. And when she started thinking about this culturally relevant text issue, found and teaching kids like values like being truthful and respecting your neighbors and your friends, she couldn't find any books that reflected the kids in her classroom that had the kind of messages she wanted. So she got on the phone and she called her friends that she knew who were interested in literacy and said, I have a list of things that I really want children's books about, to develop children's books about. Will you write them? And so I wrote two and I loved it. I wrote one about, one, she told me I could do whatever I wanted, and it has turned out to be a very popular book for little kids. And what I wrote about was how when kids come to preschool, everybody thinks it's so exciting. They're scared to death. They don't know those people. Who is that lady? What is she doing here? Where is my mother? Whose toys are those? why are these people touching my stuff? And so I wrote a book about that, and teachers read it at the beginning of the year, and kids can really relate to it because parents are excited. This is a new transition, and the kids are scared to death. So she wrote a whole library. She had us write, different people around the country write a whole library. And what she told us was, I want you to write this book. You don't own it. You don't get paid for it. It belongs to us, and it goes into a library. And I was like, okay. So we did it, and she went to the local university, and she found art students who were building their portfolios, and they did all the illustration, and the books are beautiful. And so it was a really creative way to develop a curriculum of books that she could use from year to year that reflected what she was trying to do. And so that's like a really great example of somebody who just went for it. She found a Canadian publisher that was willing to do it, to publish the books for very little. And so now she's got this great library of books that people are using now, but she, like many other people, saw that the books weren't available and so created them herself in a very creative way, in the same way that those Head Start teachers in Milwaukee, that was so creative. They just gave, and they gave everybody, those Polaroid cameras where the picture comes out. Every kid got one, so they would show up in school with these great pictures from the neighborhood. And so these are like really creative ways to get these books created. Because what if you work with a population of students that we hardly ever see? So we're talking about kids who are African American, but what if your kids are all Congolese? And so they've all come from the Congo in this refugee experience, and you're never going to find books like that. Create them yourself. We are starting to see that a lot more, and it's coming up more in conversations that I'm having with school districts. We're creating our books. Yeah, we are, because there's not a lot of them out there. And that doesn't mean that for anybody who's an author of children's books and writing these great books like Caldecott winners, we know this is not easy, and none of us are actually children's book writers. And we're not writing like anything that's going to win a Caldecott, but we are creating some things that meet the needs in our classrooms for the students that we serve. So this is becoming more common, and I'm seeing people do it in creative ways that I really admire.
Yeah, those are amazing stories. It gives me
Yeah,
hope actually that there's people who are being so thoughtful and creative for their students.
yeah, it's really fun. And the woman she was in DC. I love that she went to the university and said, do you want to illustrate a children's book? I'm not going to pay you, but you get to use the illustrations for your portfolio. And these students created these beautiful books.
Yeah, that's amazing. Very collaborative too, which is great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. So,
So
where
there
there's a
is,
will, there's a way.
so just on top of that, I think people are starting to sort of wonder where they can find resources that are available for culturally relevant readings for kids. Do you have any good resources that might be applicable to our students?
They're starting to appear on the internet. So one of the ones that I really recommend is Maya's Book Nook. And Maya is 6 years old, and her mother is a professor at Florida State University. And when Maya was a little girl, they started when she was a baby. Well, she's still little, she's 6. But when she was a baby, her mother was looking for diverse books, and then it became something that she and Maya did together. And so they started cataloging them for people. And so it's Maya's Book Nook. You can find it on the internet, and it's like a resource of diverse books. Also, in the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the things that they did was to create a library of books. And so you can find them there. And so we're starting to see people pulling together the resources that currently do exist for kids. So there are some catalogs out there.
Great, great, great. Well, we are at time, so I just want to say thank you so much for your time. Julie Washington, it's been wonderful. I think it's totally relevant to what we do, so I'm excited to share it in a video with the rest of our volunteer team. Thank you guys for being here today on a Saturday.
Yes,
Uh,
thank you.
and I just would like to say overall, thank you for joining us for this lecture series. This was our last one for the summer. I hope you enjoy the rest of your summer, but please stay connected with us through our website, through our social media. There is going to be a blog about both of our lectures this summer. And I will be sending out a video link once we have it. So thank you again, Ms. Washington, for your
Thank
time. Really
you.
appreciate
Have
it.
a great day.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.